So the Gallup organization regularly publishes what they call a well-being index. It's Gallup's way of determining happiness. And the last time I looked at it, they determined that the happiest people in America were, ready? Asian, practicing Jews, tall, at least 65 years old, live in Hawaii, own their own business, are married, have children, and have a household income of more than $120,000 a year. So, using those criteria, the New York Times went looking for somebody who fit all those qualifications. Now, I can't imagine that it was easy finding an Asian who is a practicing Jew who fits all the other criteria, but they did it. And his name is Alvin Wong, and he lives in Honolulu. And the NPR reporter who I heard this from remarked that, ironically, the unhappiest person in America was Alvin Wong's wife, because she was married to someone who was some damn smug. So I want to examine the whole concept of smugness today, as it relates to Nicodemus, who is featured in this morning's text, which is the second text in the season of Lent. Long time ago, I went to seminary not to become a minister, but because I wanted to learn more about the Bible. And, you know, life happens. 5 years later, I graduated and entered the church business, poised to let the world know everything I'd learned about the Bible. And it was a bouncy ride at first. I was all for reading the Bible on its own terms, not according to some ideology. So I had favorite parts of it and not so favorite parts of it, and I was clear about that in church. And I remember one young man in our church told me that he wasn't really satisfied with my views. He said that all he needed to know about the Bible could be summed up in the following little ditty that said, "God said it, I believe it, that settles it." Don't confuse me with the facts, right? So, if you get your theology off bumper stickers, you might be satisfied with that. But this morning's story of Jesus' meeting with Nicodemus shouts for something more, something deeper, something more nuanced. It's the story of a man who's well-educated in the theology of his day and who is just as satisfied with what he knows about God and Holy Writ as the young man that I just quoted from years ago. He doesn't want to hear a whole lot more. Now, I think it does us all good to hear from these kinds of people, and instead of snickering, as I am tempted to do, to admit that we all tend to smug self-satisfaction when it comes to our religious views, right? It's so hard to think of God except through recourse to our own experience, our prejudices, right? Whatever form our own particular narrowness takes. But the theologian Karl Barth warned against this a whole century ago when he said, "God is not man uttered in a loud voice." Liberals, of course, can be every bit as smug and closed-minded as the people that we call fundamentalists. I remember hearing of a visit the late ultra-liberal Episcopal priest Shelby Spong made to Duke University a few years ago. As part of a panel discussion on faith, Bishop Spong said, "My daughter has her PhD in physics. How on earth can she be expected to believe in the bodily resurrection of Jesus?" Well, the man who was dean of the chapel there at Duke responded, "Well, I guess we'd have to meet your daughter. Has she any imagination? Some physicists don't. Has she ever traveled outside New Jersey? Does she enjoy surprises?" Well, our text this morning says that Nicodemus comes to Jesus by night. And night in the Gospel of John is more than night. This is a poetic term. It is ignorance. It is seeing but not seeing. It's a time of confusion and not knowing, which makes it all the more odd to find a man like Nicodemus in the dark. This is odd because Nicodemus is a leader of the synagogue. He's a knowledgeable person. Nicodemus is all of us who think we are, in the know. Look at his first words to Jesus. He says, "Rabbi, we know." And he speaks out of this self-confident, secure worldview where there are some who know and are certain, and who sometimes are so smug in their certitude that they smell of it. They know the immutable truth about human beings, that people are born once, grow old, and die, and that's it. Nicodemus is proud about how he knows the limits of things and what is possible and what is impossible. Jesus, he says, "Can we talk teacher to teacher? Now we know that you, Jesus, must be from God, for your work seems certifiably divine." "Not so fast," says Jesus, stopping him. Nobody knows what is possible with God unless one is born from above, reborn from top to bottom by the Spirit. And with that, Nicodemus is stopped. He's dislodged. He's dislocated. It isn't exactly what he expects. "How can this be?" he asks, which sums up the rest of Nicodemus's conversation, which amounts to a whining attempt to put together the pieces of his worldview that Jesus seems to have blown up and scattered in just a moment. So what's this text all about? Well, old Nicodemus came to Jesus to get a few things nailed down, a few things more rigorously defined and settled. And here Jesus is launching out into dangerously wild, unexplored territory, ruled not by what we know, not by conventional wisdom, but rather by what Jesus insists is the world of the Spirit. And we all know the Greek word for spirit is wind, right? How can you tame the wind? So we're talking here, remember, about smugness. It's so pervasive today. People with that attitude get a lot of attention in this country today. Cable news is full to brimming with smugness. And look, you can find just as much of it on MSNBC as you do on Fox News. I admit it. Now again, let's examine our own hearts. Let's admit that there is that in every one of us that is attracted to something so categorically smug as, "God said it, I believe it, that settles it, I don't want to think anymore." But let us not forget something, and that is that Nicodemus, who had everything neatly nailed down, still found himself attracted to this new guy, this Jesus guy. And this attraction was a mystery to Nicodemus. You can see it in the text in the in-between places. He couldn't see how what Jesus had to say might actually fit into his predetermined program of thought, and yet there was still something about this guy he could not ignore. We all have had that experience, right, where we've heard someone who is saying things categorically against what we believe, and yet their train of thought seems like our train. We're following something that's familiar. Too often we look at this text and emphasize Nicodemus's thick-headedness. "Teacher," he says, "how is a man to be born again? Can he enter into a woman's womb a second time?" Easy to dismiss that. Well, focusing that way, we miss our own obtuseness. And to his credit, Nicodemus summoned the courage to follow his instincts. He's someone who wants more from life than the settled, prepackaged, and generic. And to his eternal credit, he's beginning to understand that God summons us from the future, and the future always requires some getting used to, right? Sometimes it requires that we follow an instinct and not worry a decision we're about to make to death. Let me tell you what I mean. Years ago, I read a book called Blink by Malcolm Gladwell, and I bet a lot of you read that book as well. The subtitle, remember, was "The Power of Thinking Without Thinking." It's about how human beings often can't see the trees for the forest, how sometimes by trusting only in logical process and not our instincts, we can be blind. The first story that Gladwell tells is about a supposed ancient statue that came to the attention of the Getty Museum in Malibu. I hope you've been there, one of my favorite places. This is back in 1986. It was called a kouros, a statue of a male nude with one leg slightly in front of the other and both arms relaxed at the sides. There are about 200 of these in existence. And this one, though, was unique because this one was in nearly perfect condition. The price tag was $10 million. The Getty took it on loan while their experts checked the provenance and their scientists checked the statue itself. They drilled into it, took a sample which tested positive as several thousand years old. Everything seemed fine. Then, nearing the time set for its formal acquisition, 3 different art experts visited the Getty Museum. Among them was the noted Thomas Hoving, who was former director of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. All 3 were taken to see the statue, not yet on display, and all 3 had the exact same reaction. Their stomachs dropped when they first laid eyes on it, and they asked, "Have you paid for this yet?" Each of them said that it just looked wrong. They couldn't explain it. Their instincts, trained over decades, told them something was amiss. One of the experts pointed to the fingernails on the statue, saying, this just can't be antique. Their demurring led the museum to check everything all over again. And on closer look, they saw that one of the letters about the statue's provenance, dated to 1952, had a zip code on it. Something that didn't exist until 1963. Why had the Getty experts missed, over a period of months, what 3 outside experts saw within 2 seconds, the blink of an eye? Well, the Getty was a young museum. In 1986, it hoped to establish a world-class reputation in a hurry, and that blinded them to the oddities of the work and locked them into what ended up being flawed scientific analysis about dating. Blink, the book, discusses another kind of dating, speed dating. Remember that? 15 single heterosexual women come together with 15 single heterosexual men they've never met, and they get 6 minutes to check each other out and decide whether they'd like to get to know each other or not. 6 minutes, 6 minutes, 6 minutes. They switch and switch and switch. Saves a lot of time and hopefully a lot of mess. As with most everything else, people have studied this phenomenon and have said the following, that what men and women say they want in a partner and what they end up really responding to is very different. We rationalize all the time, but we also have this other process going on in our brains that allows us to size things up quickly. That is what Gladwell is interested in Blink, how those 2 processes work, where each is effective and why each breaks down sometimes. He tells stories of police officers who have to make split-second decisions about life and death, and firefighters who depend first on their instincts when entering a burning building, and Wall Street traders who succeed or fail on hunches. One little snapshot in the book is about the billionaire George Soros, seen through the eyes of his son on his father's success. The son said, "My father will sit down and give you theories of why he does this or that. But I remember seeing it as a kid and thinking, at least half of this is bullshit." I mean, the reason he changes his position on the market or whatever is because his back starts killing him. He literally goes into spasms, and it's this early warning sign. Nicodemus came out at night to see Jesus because he couldn't stay away. He'd seen something in Jesus the first minute he was with him. Everything he learned in school told him to dismiss this Galilean peasant, but he couldn't sleep. Something inside him, something in his back, wouldn't let him stay home. How can this be, he asks. Well, perhaps it's true, as Jesus said, that sometimes God hides secrets from the wise and reveals them to the simple. Sometimes, but not always. It depends, right? So how do you make important decisions, right? Do you worry a decision to death before deciding? Or being more decisive, are you able to size things up quickly and just move? Or let me put it this way, do you act patiently and deliberately, or do you tend to be impulsive and reckless? See where I'm going with this? See how tricky this whole business is. We're all different. We're all in different places on our lives' journeys. Regardless of our methods, the story of Nicodemus suggests that we ought to steer clear of smugness and rethink our methods of decision-making from time to time. The psychologist Carl Jung once said that in order to truly grow up in the second half of life, we need to ask ourselves if the principles that governed the first half of our lives were really worthy, whatever they were. He said that we need to at least ask ourselves if the opposite might in fact be in some way valid. In the second half of life, says Carl Jung, you should be mature enough to see some truth in what you once saw as untruth. And you should also be able to see some untruth even in your truth. Do not be astonished that I said to you, you must be born from above, Jesus said to Nicodemus, breaking down the box he lived in, stretching the limits of the possible. The wind of God's Spirit blows where it chooses, and it's beyond your knowing, says Jesus. To be a follower of Jesus is to be willing to have our categories redefined, our God boxes dismantled, to be blown by the Spirit into places we had never dreamed of going. You know, we hear nothing about Nicodemus after this night until toward the end, the end of John's Gospel. Jesus, the one to whom he came at night with questions, is dead and crucified, and among the few daring to be near him now was Nicodemus. In fact, Nicodemus doesn't say anything here at the end. He doesn't come as an interrogator. He only comes to be close. He comes bearing a gift, in fact, to help embalm the body of Jesus. Comes to honor him. Offers not questions or answers, but sweet-smelling spices whose aroma is carried by a wind that blows where it will, even today.